welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about the mystery of the Mary Celeste. On November 7th, 1872, merchant ship Mary Celeste set off from New York City for Genoa with 10 people, ample provisions, and a cargo of denatured alcohol. On December 4th, the ship was discovered drifting in the Atlantic Ocean, still with plenty of provisions and its cargo of 1,700 barrels of alcohol, but with no trace of the 10 people who had left New York except a missing lifeboat. The Mary Celeste was originally named the Amazon, and it was constructed in 1861 in Nova Scotia. After some mishaps at sea, including the death of a previous captain, it was transferred to American ownership in 1868, and it was named Mary Celeste. On this fateful trip, she was captained by a man named Benjamin Briggs, who was from a family of sailors. His father was also a ship captain, and 2 of his brothers would go on to become captains as well. 10 years before his last voyage, he married his cousin, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, and together the couple had a son named Arthur and a daughter named Sophia. Briggs was a respected and successful captain, rising to the rank of a licensed master mariner. He even invested some of his own savings into a share of Mary Celeste. He captained his first voyage with the Mary Celeste in October of 1872, following the same route from New York to Genoa, Italy. He brought along his wife and infant daughter, while his son stayed behind with his grandmother so he could keep attending school. His first mate, Albert G. Richardson, had sailed under Briggs before, and the rest of the crew were remarked upon to be quite capable at sea by Sarah Briggs. The same individuals made the next trip out from New York: a well-regarded captain, his wife, infant daughter, and 7 men who were described in testimony as, quote, first-class sailors, end quote. The Sunday before he left, Captain Briggs wrote to his mother, quote, "Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage," end quote. What could go wrong? The ship initially left the pier on November 5th, but anchored off Staten Island to wait for weather to improve. 2 days later, Mary Celeste made her way into the open ocean. Nearby, the Canadian brigantine Dei Gratia awaited a shipment of petroleum to ship along the same course to Genoa as the Mary Celeste. Some even say that Captain David Morehouse knew Captain Briggs, or that the two were even close friends, but it's unclear if there's any evidence for that assertion or if it's just a romantic fantasy brought on by the following events. On December 4th, Captain Morehouse was alerted to another vessel about 6 miles away, apparently heading toward the Dei Gratia erratically. Just looking at the ship, Morehouse could see something was off. The sails were set oddly, and as the ship drew closer, he could see no one on deck. After receiving no response to signals sent to the ship, Morehouse sent 2 of his men to investigate. When the 2 men boarded the ship, noting that the name across its stern said Mary Celeste, they found a deserted ship. Some of the sails were damaged or missing. One of the pumps wasn't working, while the main hatch was secure. 2 others were open, and the ship's only lifeboat was gone. Over a meter of water was in the hold, which isn't an alarming amount, but it might be a little bit more than normal, and a rod for measuring the water was found dropped on deck. The court record states that, quote, "The galley was in a bad state, the stove was knocked out of its place, and the cooking utensils were strewn around. The whole ship was a thoroughly wet mess," end quote. Checking the ship's log, the men saw that the final entry was dated at 8 a.m. 9 days earlier, on November 25th. It recorded the position of Mary Celeste nearly 400 nautical miles, or 740 kilometers, from their current location, and supposedly within sight of the Azores off the coast of Portugal. Most of the ship's papers and navigational instruments were missing, but a large stock of provisions were still found in the ship's stores. After the men reported back to Morehouse, he decided to split his crew between his own ship and the Mary Celeste so that he could bring the abandoned ship into Gibraltar as salvage. At the salvage hearing, suspicions that something violent had happened aboard Mary Celeste grew, particularly in the Attorney General of Gibraltar, Frederick Solly Flood. Flood ordered an examination of the ship, which resulted in some questionable observations. Some cuts were noted on either side of the bow, which at the time were determined to have been made deliberately. Possible traces of blood were found on the captain's sword, and stains thought to possibly be blood were found on railings near a mark possibly made by an axe. Because a container of sewing machine oil was found upright, it was determined that the ship likely didn't go through stormy weather, although this oil may not have actually existed. Reports also concluded that the ship had not been involved in a collision with another ship or with land. With this evidence in hand, Flood came to the conclusion that the crew had gotten into the cargo of denatured alcohol, which is not really potable or safe to consume, so drinking it would be very difficult, and it would be very unlikely that someone would drink enough to get drunk and kill the captain and his family in a drunken frenzy before staging a collision and taking off in the lifeboat. 9 barrels of the alcohol cargo were empty when the ship finally unloaded in Genoa, but that may not have been known at the time. He also thought that Morehouse and his crew were lying about the location they found the ship, as well as the original contents of the ship's log. When James Winchester, one of the owners of the Mary Celeste, showed up asking when the ship would be released so it could deliver its cargo, Flood told him he'd have to pay a surety of $15,000, which at the time was quite a lot, and an amount that Winchester didn't have. Flood thought that Winchester may have even intentionally hired a crew to kill Briggs and his first and second mate, and Winchester testified that Captain Briggs wouldn't have abandoned the ship, except in an extreme situation, and the rest of the crew were competent seamen, and there apparently was no evidence this wasn't true. Additionally, some of the evidence Flood had been so sure about before turned out to not be accurate. Analysis of the supposed blood stains found on the ship showed that it was not blood, and another report showed that the marks on the bow were not deliberately made by hand, but came from the natural effects of the timber used in the area. Without evidence backing his suspicions of foul play, Flood was forced to release Mary Celeste. So what did happen? There are several theories. The first is that Flood was right, at least to some extent, and that foul play was involved. Even though no evidence collected at the time supported it, suspicions of various motivations for foul play linger to this day. Insurance fraud was another motive thrown out there, on the supposed basis that the Mary Celeste had been overinsured and Winchester wanted the ship to wreck or be lost so he and the other owners could collect. Another theory points the finger at Captain Morehouse, suggesting that the Dei Gratia had somehow sped ahead of the Mary Celeste, which had left earlier and was a faster ship, and ambushed them for the salvage reward. Others think Morehouse and Briggs were in the plan together, or that pirates attacked the ship. Again, there was no evidence backing any of these theories, and in fact, the evidence points to the opposite. Why, for example, would the entire crew and Briggs' family never be seen again if he was involved? Why would pirates leave behind the ship's cargo if they'd attacked, but thoroughly cleaned away any evidence of their presence? Another theory that is a bit more plausible is that the crew feared their cargo of alcohol might explode. If rough waters or a seaquake had shaken the ship and its cargo enough, fumes from the alcohol could have built up and caused the crew to leave the ship out of caution and improperly tie the lifeboat to a tow line so that it drifted and was lost. Considering the cargo seemed to be secure when the ship was recovered, and given that the crew likely would have been able to paddle back to the ship in most situations, this theory may not be as likely. Another, possibly more likely scenario involves the amount of water in the hold and the sounding rod that was found on deck. The first mate of the Dei Gratia actually suggested that a false reading with the sounding rod may have given the false impression that the Mary Celeste was taking on water and was in danger of sinking. A waterspout is one possible cause of the amount of water in the hold, the damage to the sails, and pressure which could have pulled water up from the bilges at the bottom of the ship, making it look like it had taken on even more water. Again, the crew may have left the ship in the lifeboat and improperly secured it. Records of weather in the area on the day and the last log entry indicate that there was heavy rain and wind. The ship had also previously transported coal, which could have clogged some of the instruments with dust and caused them to be faulty. If Captain Briggs thought that the ship was closer to the shore than it actually was because of the faulty instruments, he may have tried to make it to shore if he thought that the ship itself was unsafe. There are also other stories about what may have happened to the Mary Celeste as it passed into legend. Many of these were intended to be fiction, even if some people didn't take them that way, but others claimed to be fact. It was often described in these stories that the ship was in pristine condition with still warm food on the table and lights lit, as if its occupants had just left. An early story by Arthur Conan Doyle, which is probably to blame for the continuing mystery of the Mary Celeste in popular culture was J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement. Although ostensibly based on what happened to the Mary Celeste, it changed essentially every detail, including the name of the ship itself, which is why some people think that it's called the Mary Celeste, which is what it was named in his story. In Doyle's story, which he didn't really intend to be taken seriously, the mystery of the ship was revealed to have been caused by a half-caste man who hated white people and convinced the black members of the crew to murder the captain and take off with the ship to Africa. The narrator is the only white person to survive because he has a magic charm which the Africans worship. Yeah. It was after he wrote this story that people really even found out about the Mary Celeste. Like, it wasn't really that big of a deal when it happened. But after this, some people thought that this story was actually true, and a lot of other people started writing about it. Another story in the Strand magazine explained that everyone aboard had either drowned or was eaten by sharks after a swimming platform they'd constructed collapsed. Additional stories involved secret treasure, giant sea creatures, and many, many miraculous soul survivors. Paranormal explanations have been offered as well, ranging from the lost continent of Atlantis to the Bermuda Triangle, which it wasn't anywhere near, to, of course, alien abduction. Interestingly, the actual true end of the Mary Celeste may have been inspired by its past. In 1884, the ship was filled with essentially worthless cargo, which was insured at a much higher value, and intentionally wrecked against a coral reef in an attempt at insurance fraud. So that was the end of the Mary Celeste. Though we'll probably never know for certain what happened to the 10 people who disappeared that day, I think it's safe to say that Arthur Conan Doyle's imagining of the events aren't true, but they have kept the mystery of the Mary Celeste alive to this day. So that's it for this video. Like, subscribe, and all that jazz, and I will see you guys later.